So, good afternoon, everybody. I can see from the counter that we've got many people still joining, but we'll make a start to the IED's first COVID-19 response webinar. Many thanks for joining us, and we're delighted to say we've got a strong panel today to answer questions. So we've got Alexander Jan from Arup, Ciaran Gunne-Jones from Lichfields, Suzanne Malcolm, who's from South Oxfordshire, but also a board member of the IED, and David Fletcher from Hampshire. And I'll let them introduce themselves more formally. I'd like to thank them all for joining, especially Arup and Lichfields, two of our corporate members. And I'd also like to thank Sarah Lynn Challoner from the IED, who's gained a PhD in Zoom in the space of 2 days to set this up. And Phil Smith of Phil Smith Communications, whose idea it was to kick these off, his PR advisor. And then finally, do check out the IED website. At the end of this webinar, we'll post more of the questions that have been answered. There's already quite a lot of blogs on there on our COVID page section. As a membership body, for those of you who aren't members, we'd obviously encourage you to consider membership. And then the way this will work is we'll have introductions and some introductory remarks from each of our panel members, and then we'll have some questions. I've already been sent some questions by people on the call, but you can also type questions using the Q&A facility at the bottom of your panel, so you should be able to get those across. We had 253 registrations. I can see that there's already 165 people on the call, so welcome all. Finally, just as ever, the fire announcement. We're not expecting a fire alarm today, and if it does go off, stay where you are, because it's in one of the 6 people's houses who are currently on this call. Probably start with introductions, and start with Alexander Jan, if we can, from Arup.
Nigel, thank you very much for that, and it's a delight to be here. This is the first one I've done, so my apologies in advance to my co-panel members and participants if you start hearing the noise of the fish tank in the background or other things. Fire alarms not going off in my case. So as you said, Arup, I'm from Arup, Chief Economist at Arup. Delighted to be a corporate member of the IED. I guess that a lot of our work is around the whole agenda of helping local authorities in normal times to navigate issues around regeneration, high streets, how to finance and fund projects, working with business improvement districts, and so on. So we have quite a lot of experience in that area, and we've done a lot of work on the Housing Infrastructure Fund initiative, on the High Streets initiative, and on major transport schemes as they affect local economies in particular.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alexander. Ciaran.
Thanks, Nigel. Yeah, just by way of introduction, so I'm Ciaran Gunne-Jones, and I lead the economics team at Lichfields. Also, corporate members of the IED, and very pleased to have a long association with the organisation. In terms of our work, it's very much focused around supporting local authorities, local enterprise partnerships and other public agencies in delivery of broadly economic development and regeneration, and also planning projects, but also then supporting private sector clients, developers, infrastructure providers, and so on, in making the business case for their investments and to securing the necessary permissions to implement those.
Thank you. David?
Thank you, Nigel. Yes, David Fletcher, Assistant Director for Economic Development for Hampshire County Council. Thanks to the IED for providing this opportunity for hopefully a healthy debate around an agenda that's close to us all at the moment. Just a little bit about, I suppose, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. It's probably one of the largest economies in England. I think we did a a bit of a league table recently. I think we're the largest economy in England not to have a combined authority. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but quite an interesting landscape in that Hampshire and the Isle of Wight as a whole has, including the county council, 15 local authorities and 2 LEP. So that makes the landscape quite an interesting one to operate in. The county council not being a rates billing authority, we've not been wrapped up quite as much with getting out the grants to businesses, but that's maybe given us a bit more time and space to think a bit more about the longer term recovery in Hampshire as well. And I've now been asked to chair the business and economy work stream within the local resilience forum, so I can maybe touch on that a little bit later on. Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you, David. And Suzanne. Suzanne, you're on mute.
Sorry.
That's right.
Joys of Zoom. Good afternoon, everybody. As Nigel mentioned, I'm actually a director of IED and have been since 2015. My day job is acting Deputy Chief Executive for Place for South Oxfordshire and Vale White Horse District Councils, 2 district councils within Oxfordshire, who have a shared management across the 2 authorities. So my day job involves managing service areas including development and regeneration, planning and environment and housing. So whilst that's the normal day job, the day job at the moment is very much dealing with the local authority response to COVID. So look forward to sharing some of that as we go through the webinar today.
Thanks, Suzanne. I thought I'd put up just some initial thoughts that we'd had amongst ourselves, but thinking about what's going on and the fact that this could even be a 4-phase process. We're obviously in the middle of this initial severe shock. As we come out of it, it'd be interesting to hear what people's thoughts are on this call around the supply chain dislocation. Can we get back to normal straight away? Because we've got things happening in the supply chain that mean we can't get back to normal. I think then, particularly around professional services, business services, there might be a pipeline impact of the work that hasn't been won while we've all been sat looking at our desks at home. And then I've made a typo on the next one, but the broader recession that no doubt will follow. And then to what extent we can talk about today around whether we think this is going to accelerate past trends. So some of the things that were already happening, retails, pubs closing, work from home, etc. Or are we going to actually see change that's going to change some industries forever that we just didn't even foresee before this all started? And then to what extent is some of this an opportunity to rethink supply chains and actually increase our local input? And maybe to start off with, if I do ask the panel to what extent they think we're going to see an acceleration of the past or actually some new things, and whether they see any opportunities in any of this, or whether it's unremittingly gloomy for the time being. So maybe if anybody's got an initial thought on that, they can raise a hand and we can go to whoever's first. I'll just pick somebody. Alexandra, are you happy to?
I think so, Nigel. Okay, so I mean, I think the answer to your question is that it's going to be a combination of both. So I think we definitely will see an acceleration of some of the trends pre the pandemic. So for example, in the case of transport, we know that there has been a long-term decline in the number of commuting trips per person of working age for about the last 10 to 15 years. And that in turn reflects a change in the labour market structure. So more people working in the gig economy, more people self-employed, more people working from home, and of course, more people choosing to work fewer days of the week. So I think that we're definitely going to see a reinforcement and potentially an acceleration in that, and that's one example. Another, of course, is retail, which we're all very familiar with in terms of the structural changes that have been going on there. And again, I think that notwithstanding the government's efforts in the form of 100% relief for retailers, business rate relief, and other measures designed to provide support, such as the employment retention program and so forth, it is likely that again, some of the shifts in retail, I think, that we saw happening will be accelerated through the crisis. Now, in terms of, if I touch very quickly on what might change, I think that economies, particularly city centres that have historically been structured around high levels of public transport use and a sort of the shared workspace phenomena of putting more people into less space through the WeWork type model and various other approaches. I think those two things are likely to change in the short to medium term, not least because of the way in which social distancing is going to play out. So I think, paradoxically, we're probably entering a world now where areas which are less dense and less dependent on public transport may actually be at a competitive advantage in the short to medium term, as they're able to cope with the impact of social distancing on getting people into work and back to work. So a few thoughts from me on that front.
And either picking up on those, Ciaran, or your own thoughts from the work you've been doing. I know Lichfields have published some stuff on this. What views did you have?
Yeah, I mean, very, very similar to what Alexander's described, I think, in terms of some of the short versus longer term changes. I mean, just to pick up on a couple that he mentioned, I mean, I think taking sort of retail and town centres, there's quite an interesting point here about whether actually after all this is over at some level is actually whether people will start to value town centres and the role that they play in the community and the access to them. And indeed, for example, having green infrastructure close by within urban areas and so on, you get a sense that by not having had access to that in an enforced way, it might actually change people's perception and start to appreciate that. I think it probably will accelerate the e-commerce trend, because I think once more people have tried it, they may well stick with it. But I think that agenda that we probably as a profession have been articulating for some years now about how town centres reimagine themselves as places that people want to spend time, I can see actually a real new sense of appreciation for that potentially. In terms of logistics, that's the one that I'm hearing most from people that I've talked to about. This could look very different. This was already being reimagined in many ways because of Brexit and all the uncertainty that had caused. And supply chains, and I think it was one of the overarching questions you'd raised, Nigel, are already being kind of refashioned. So we are genuinely looking at only weeks left in terms of warehousing capacity in this country. And I can see a situation after this immediate crisis is over, that the sort of the leverage points within those supply chains may well end up being redesigned to countenance more situations like the one that we're facing. To pick up on another one that I've heard a lot of speculation about, and I'd be interested to see what others this afternoon think, is this the death of the traditional workspace, the traditional office? And I think I've seen some commentary suggest that, well, once we're all Zoom perfect, there won't be any need to go into an office anymore. And I don't know, I guess each to their own on these things, but my sense in an entirely unscientific poll, I think, is that actually now people are even more realising how much they miss going into the office and talking to their colleagues. They might not do it every day of the week anymore, perhaps, but actually that engagement and the processes of doing that with other people, assuming that, of course, in time the social distancing allows us to do that, I think may well actually really incentivise that trend of quite exciting workspaces and people possibly appreciating them more perhaps than they might have done before.
Thanks, Ciaran. And just to reassure the people who are online, we are getting your questions through now, so they are arriving. And to reflect that, David and Suzanne, in answering the broader question that we've posed, but also just thinking about the short-term public interventions that can be done, particularly around hospitality and retail, when you reflect on that. But David, do you have some broader comments, and then particularly this shorter term work that can be done around retail and hospitality?
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. I suppose first of all, might be controversial to say this, but to congratulate the government for the way it did actually respond. It was probably never going to be perfect when you design it in that period of time, but I think certainly in terms of speed of response, certainly when you look back at what previous recessions have taught us, is that quick intervention is one of the ways of reducing the longer term impact. So hopefully that will be the case on this occasion. I think what's been sort of maybe slightly more disappointing is the way regionally we've been very patchy in terms of how we've tried to cover some of the gaps. Very different approaches in different areas. And I think probably what I'd like to see our profession do is help to inject a bit more science into how that support is targeted in the future. And that's always, there's always, I suppose this is where, you know, in local government land, you've always got that tension between there being a real sort of imperative locally to be seen to be doing something, but at the same time making sure the finite resources we do have are targeted appropriately. So, you know, traditionally sectors such as retail, hospitality, probably, if I'm honest, you know, they don't generally feature very high in my list of priority sectors. But I think we're in a very different world at the moment where certainly locally there's a massive imperative around getting people back into work, getting businesses back up and running, even if they're those smaller businesses that are critical for a local community. I think our profession has quite a role to play in terms of helping with that sort of slightly more maybe medium-term support in terms of how that's targeted. And I suppose it's not losing those key principles that we've maybe applied in the past. You know, I was always a big fan of the Nesta research, which looked at which parts of the business community generated the best value in terms of growth of jobs, et cetera, and that was largely kind of innovation orientated businesses. And I suppose it's not letting go of all of those principles just because we're in a bit of a crisis. I think the interesting thing, you know, Ciaran mentioned the workspace thing. I'm probably another part of the same sample that, you know, absolutely getting weary of just doing everything through a machine and wanting to get back to some sort of human interaction. So I'd like to think we will still want workspaces. They might be slightly different in scale and nature longer term, but I think we'll certainly still want them. I think the other, I had a conversation a few days ago with one of the LEP chairs, and he was saying, in reality, will the new normal be that different? In other words, will people's retail behaviours be that different? You know, will people revert back to, well, I can get it on Amazon for £10 less, so that's what I'll go to it. You'd like to think not, but human nature being what it is, I think there's a risk of that. And I suppose finally, the other point I just wanted to make was around a key strand of our kind of recovery thoughts are around the kind of infrastructure projects that were already in the pipeline. So, for example, in Hampshire, you've got an extension to the runway at Southampton Airport. You've got a new cruise terminal at the Port of Southampton. Both of those sectors, you know, the cruise sector and the aviation sector, huge question marks over what their future will look like and what the demand is in those particular arenas. And so the business cases behind those infrastructure projects probably need revisiting, because the assumptions that were built into those plans that were probably drafted a year plus ago, certainly the goalposts have moved in a big way. And also, of course, the whole climate change agenda has become much more prevalent. So politically, with, you know, climate emergencies being declared, et cetera, there's a lot of variables in the equation at the moment. So some of those big infrastructure projects, which we might see as part of our sort of medium to long-term recovery, some of the assumptions associated with those probably need a bit of revisiting.
Yeah, Yeah. Yes. Who'd be an economic forecaster in the current climate? Suzanne, finally, sort of overarching comments on the economic questions posed, but also this business around the short-term measure that councils can deal with.
Yeah. So I would echo David's comments regarding the government investment. I think by all means it's not perfect, but I think the fact that they acted quickly to support the small business community has been broadly welcomed by the businesses that I speak to. I think my broader concern is around the retail sector. I think, you know, the government has ploughed quite significant funds through initiatives to try and support the high street, and we've seen a lot in recent years. I think there will be a hesitancy to put any more money into the high street from central government. The message that we're getting at a local authority level is that they're looking at much more regional investments. So back to David's points around infrastructure. So I think the new normal will be about those bigger infrastructure projects and investing in them. And I think that's likely where we're going to see the flow of cash going towards. From a local authority point of view, changes to structure is inevitable. We're, you know, already thinking that we're likely to see a push towards unitary in Oxfordshire, and perhaps even regional geographies we might be going back to. We're already seeing that in the recovery plan work that government are advising us about is being pushed through that kind of regional LEP structure rather than through local authorities. So I do believe there is a role for local authorities in this, because actually we're the ones at the ground level that have the interaction with businesses and know what's going on in our patches. I think the challenge will be feeding that intel into wider recovery strategies being led by LEPs and regional groupings, and making sure that those needs of those businesses are recognised. But I do worry about the retail sector, because I think we will struggle to get them recognised within it, and I think we're going to see a radical change, an even more radical change than we were already seeing coming across our high streets.
Thank you. I think that picks up on some of the questions that were being asked too. So trying to wrap a few of those together. To what extent do we think that the town deals that were being put forward before the crisis and that people were responding to, and also this reshaping of town centres with offices, but are offices going to be the future as shared space, innovation centres, business centres? Where do we see that going, and where do we see the town deal opportunity to be reshaped to deal with this in some way? Yeah, Alexander.
Well, I mean, it's a really good question, because those of us who are involved in supporting local authorities with town deals, town centre deals, and high street fund and so forth, will know that the process, certainly for the high street fund, has just kind of continued to roll on as if the environment within which we are sitting hasn't really occurred. And in a way, what else, given all the other things on the government's plate and all the rest of it, it's understandable at one level that's kind of become the default position. I mean, I think what this raises is a hugely important question, which is how do we, the government's put in all these measures, and then the really interesting and important question is how we're going to transition from those to whatever the recovery projection looks like. And we know from history that when events such as this have happened in the past, the government has taken particular measures, such as the introduction of income tax. That's a good example. Which happened,
wasn't it, in about 1700? Or...
Indeed, it was a temporary measure, I think introduced, others will correct me, in the 19th century, perhaps before the First World War, the Second World War, or maybe after the Second World War, not being very helpful. But that was a temporary measure, and we've seen that stay. We've seen things like, the no running of public transport on Christmas Day. Again, temporary measure, which occurred in the 1970s, partly in response to the oil crisis. That then became permanent. So I guess my point is, to what extent are things like 100% business rate relief for retail and other interventions that are being put in, how easy are those really going to be to unwind for the government in the recovery period? And I think for me, in terms of trying to answer the question around office space and other things, the crucial question is to what extent social distancing is going to be a lasting requirement going forward, because that is going to determine the extent to which the economics of office space and indeed public transport provision are going to be sustainable in terms of the existing models. So if there is uncertainty around how the virus spreads or returns, which is on the on that side of the equation, the medical side of the equation, that's going to potentially prove to be a bit of a lasting disruption, both to the office market segment and how we provide public transport. And public transport in the UK is unusual because of its high dependency on the fare box. That's always historically been thought as a really good thing, that people are paying more of the cost of services. Now, of course, it's a bit of an Achilles heel. And there are two ways to go, really. Either we can go the way of providing more space, so increasing frequencies of service, or local authorities allowing more offices to go up to accommodate social distancing. Or we can go the other way, which is we see a contraction and a much more selective use of both public transport and office space, so that people's expectation, as Ciaran and David were kind of intimating, is, the expectation from employers, for example, might be people come into the offices only for specific requirements and needs, rather than the more traditional 9-to-5 approach, which was, as I mentioned earlier, it was already under pressure. And I think from a planning point of view, the really interesting question is, will local authorities respond to this challenge? Will they need to respond if it's going to be a lasting feature of the market by allowing more development, or are we going to see, for example, a shift towards residential growth in areas like central London to offset the fact that office space is going to be uneconomic to provide in this new world, and therefore we'll see a structural change in land use? And I don't have the answers to those, but I think by thinking those scenarios through, we can then prepare ourselves for the sorts of responses that we might see emerging in the market.
Yes, well, as we said at the beginning of this call, none of us got the answers, but they're useful questions to pose. And I know, Ciaran, you guys get involved in a lot of the town activity, town deal activity. How do you see this panning out?
Well, I mean, I think, to pick up the broader point, and I think it's the point David made earlier, I think our role as professionals now, here and now, and appreciating that things are moving, literally in real time, and the assumptions we had 2 or 3 weeks ago are not going to be the same assumptions we'll have in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and who knows where we may be in 2 or 3 months' time. But I think our sense, and picking up Alexander's point about, when will the taps be turned off, some of the initiatives that have been put in place, and that's going to have a huge bearing on things, is to try and provide a sense of what do these big macro shifts mean in terms of how sectors are being affected, and to blend that with kind of the local intelligence that we all can have from the different kind of parts of the country that we operate in. What are businesses telling us? And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that some of what we've seen so far is very much kind of on-off lockdown. So, construction activity was going one day and then essentially pretty much stopped the next day. And what a lot of house builders are saying, for example, at the moment, is they're expecting within a couple of weeks' time to be, back up and running. It may not be at 100%, but they'll be back up and running. The issue may, of course, though, be that in 2 or 3 months' time, the supply chain effects that have been disrupted will start to kick in. So they will be able to restart, but not necessarily at the kind of level that they would perhaps traditionally be delivering at. And then there's other sectors, so maybe finance and business services is a good example, where in theory, the immediate effect on output shouldn't be that much. We're all carrying on doing things in those sectors, albeit working remotely. But what we will see is probably more of a lag effect. So as demand in the economy more generally perhaps starts to recover as a function of consumer confidence and all the rest of it, it may be a few months before those effects are felt. And I think that was one of the learning points from the 08-09 period, was that actually the effects in different sectors took quite a bit of time to filter through to all parts of the economy. And I think we will see some of that here. We will see a bounce back of some level, but there will be longer effects that we perhaps even at the moment don't quite know what they will be, that we will need to kind of look out for. Now, on the more specific question of town deals and future high streets fund and so on, and indeed, you know, really any of the other initiatives that are underway at the moment, I mean, my sense of those is that they need to continue to progress. As Alexander mentioned, they are progressing almost, or by and large, as if nothing's really happened. I think probably in many ways, those processes are now even more important, or will be shown to be more important. But what I'd suggest is really key, though, is that some opportunity for a stock take is built into those processes. I think there will be a temptation, both politically and in order to secure funding as quickly as possible, for some of those processes to keep marching on. And that may be right in some locations, but there is a risk that perhaps some fine-tuning around what is being proposed, and perhaps more importantly, the sense of additional priority to particular things doesn't get built into the process. So I think it's incumbent on all of us, if you're going to construct a economic recovery plan at a local or LEP area, as Suzanne was alluding to, that we stop and take that moment to say, what does the next year or 2 years sort of look like? What interventions do we have within our gift locally and working with government to deliver? And sensibly, should we be doing anything differently about those measures, recognising the real-time intelligence we're getting back from the people who represent our key sectors and also, of course, our businesses?
Yeah, thank you, Ciaran. I think from both of those answers, this timing thing, that we need to take stock now of the high street and other sectors, and that actually over time, some of the other sectors will feel this impact later. I've just stuck up this slide. I thought it might come in useful. It's just it's the current position that ONS's survey, it's only survey data, estimate for percentage where we've got closures and business carrying on as normal. So for those who are interested, the ONS has got a section on their website around the furloughing data. Any thoughts, Suzanne, from your point of view on this whole funding space and what we do with it now, whether we just carry on with bids the way they are, or whether we've actually got to look at something different? And one specific question that has been raised around the whole question of having to find match funding at a time when nobody's got any funding.
I think that's a fundamental question, really. I think, you know, to not put too fine a point on it, the country's broke, districts are broke, counties are broke. You know, where are we going to find this money from? It is a challenge, because there isn't going to be that flow of money. Yes, the government are going to have to put some sort of level of funding into recovery plan, but we all know it's not enough. We're already writing as local authorities to the government on almost a daily basis to say that we haven't got enough money to even run the COVID response work that we're anticipating is probably going to continue for up to 2 years in terms of supporting some of the vulnerable and shielded members of our communities. Added to that, we've got the additional role of supporting that business community, gathering that intel that we talked about earlier, and how are we going to fund that? So certainly from a local authority point of view, we're not going to have the funding available to directly intervene and support businesses by putting in funding for initiatives. I suspect there'll be some seed funding that will come through government, but it'll be looking for that match funding. And at this time, can we really ask businesses to put their hands in their pockets and match funds? I'm not sure that we can. So it's a really difficult question, I think, and I think it's going to be a real challenge. You know, when there's significant businesses, the big players in the industry that are looking to go out of business or shortly likely to go out of business, if they can't even manage to cope through this crisis, how is the small one-man band, two-man band on the high street or in a small office complex going to manage? And how are we as professionals going to be able to give them that level of support going forward? So I think there needs to be fundamental change. I don't know what that is, whether it's around business rates, whether it's around the structure of government in this country, but there is going to have to be a significant change if we're going to survive and move to whatever the new normal is.
I noticed this morning, Polly Toynbee in The Guardian actually referred to central government as hating local authorities, but certainly the IED has written a lot about this, and I do think it's probably a whole new webinar actually on the future funding of local government. David, I'm sure you've got some views on that, and a question we were sent in before this started as well, as to what extent do you think that there's a role for better local networks in all of this? How have you seen that play out over the last few months, or sorry, the last few weeks?
Yeah, an interesting question, and I guess it's times like this that sort of test relationships and structures to the limit, really. I think for me, I suppose two aspects to my kind of response to this. One is initially just a reaction to even the whole debate we've just been having around, you know, the different schemes, the different bids that local authorities have had to work on over the last few years. That there's almost too many initiatives, too many funds, too many kind of agendas. We all know national government always likes to be able to announce something and you know, talk about how it's contributing to the kind of economic success agenda. But I think
they don't have to run some damn competition to win the money, though, do they?
Well, absolutely. But I think it's just fragmenting priorities, really. And I think the quicker we can get to a scenario where localities actually are determining how they want to best use those resources, I think is ultimately where we want to get to. I think it's interesting, Suzanne's already pointed out the fact that, you know, the current crisis and how sort of vulnerable, if you like, we've realised the economy can be in a scenario like this one, just makes you think that we probably need to almost relook at the whole wiring around how we support local economies. I think in terms of the recovery plans, and again Suzanne sort of touched on this, is what I'd like to see, because this is something that kind of we haven't actually you know, this hasn't been concluded yet, is you know, the LEPs, certainly the LEPs in our area are very much looking at this in terms of I'm talking about the recovery planning now, very much as a sort of quite a strategic activity. Consultancies like Ciaran's, I know, are advising some of the LEPs, and I think that's great, because you need that you do need that strategic view across your economy and where you see the opportunities for growth. I think with the way the local authorities are looking at it, though, is they have a whole range of stakeholders in their economic landscapes that they need to, one, engage with, listen to, and actually ensure that some of the interventions that we're proposing, and I know Ciaran's touched on this, is some of those interventions can't be in 5-10 years' time. They need to be in a few months' time. So there's this whole balancing act between short, medium, long term. But I think if the LEPs and the local authorities work effectively together, if you have that kind of top-down strategic view, but also something that's a bit more bottom-up based on what's actually going on in your locality, I think that's where the combination of the two will be really, really potent. So I actually think local government does have a key role to play. Why would I say anything else? But I genuinely think we tend to be the entity that's more on the ground and tends to have the relationships and has to deal with the short term as well as that kind of longer term vision as well. So, you know, I think that the ideal few months will be that we are genuinely working together from both directions. That's what I'd like to see.
And it may have distracted you when you were speaking. I hope it didn't. But Sarah then had sent around a quick poll of the audience around, do we think local authorities will be more important after this? And 65% of an audience that will have a large proportion of local authority members and staff said yes, we will. But you know, I'd certainly endorse and support that. One of the questions has come in, which I think is at the nub of everything that we're here to talk about today, though, is what do we think this sectoral variation is going to look like if we play out into, say, a year's time? To what extent do you think sectors will have changed, and what do you think we'll have done to actually have helped actually make some positive steps to have supported some local areas? So it's a kind of it's the tough question, but I suppose it's the main question. Who's going to win, and how can we help them get there? With only 20 seconds to think about the answer to that, Alexander, have you?
Oh, thanks again, Nigel.
Have you got any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think what is, you know, interesting and somewhat perplexing about this crisis is the extent to which the usual favourites, i.e. places that historically have shown to themselves to be most resilient and adaptive to economic challenges, are going to still be those same places. So typically London and the southeast have, I mean, partly because they are less dependent on the public sector in terms of their economic structure. So something like 23% of London's economy is classed as being in the public sector, which contrasts to about 3/4 of Northern Ireland's GDP. So paradoxically, because those places have a smaller public sector, they've been more capable, more resilient at withstanding things like, you know, austerity and indeed the financial crisis. Now, and indeed there's some work that's been issued, I think this week, might have been by the the Royal Society, which was looking at the proportion of jobs in different areas that are likely to be affected by the pandemic based on levels of furloughing. And what was interesting, I think, about that analysis was actually the range between those areas which are most likely to be affected and those which were least likely to be affected was far closer than you normally see. So it was in the sort of 30 percentage points for the usual areas which have struggled because of structural issues around economic decline, seaside towns, some of the places in the northeast, whereas in London and the southeast they were in the high 20s. So I'm not entirely sure that in terms of from a spatial perspective that the usual, as I say, the usual suspects will do well and the usual suspects will do less well. Now, having said that, you know, that it's a very, very difficult call to play, to make. I mean, what I would say is that, you know, Ciaran touched on this around supply chains and logistics. The prospect of Brexit happening on the 31st of December in a way or shape or form which looks anything like hard, and you know, technically the government's stated policy position is that we are leaving at the end of the year from the transitional arrangements, I think could really complicate things for manufacturing, for the buildings trade and logistics, on top of COVID. So from a sectoral perspective, you know, I think we're already seeing in terms of where government money is having to go, big subsidies, big levels of financial support for the transport sector, for freight, for, you know, ferries, for our railways and indeed aviation, and areas which are particularly exposed to that level of dependency. So for example, communities around Heathrow, communities around Gatwick, highly dependent on one of those sectors. Those areas I think are going to face particular challenges. And just to pick up, without starting the whole devolution debate on this session, I do think that, you know, David is right that local authorities know their areas best, they know their economies best, and we have to find a way of allowing them to get on with the recovery work and to harness that knowledge and understanding. Because as we've seen with the public health response in the UK, it is, government just struggles with a one-size-fits-all approach. They just, by virtue of the fact that the needs of these areas are different, reflecting their economic and other structures. And one of the early lessons from abroad appears to be that those countries with strong regional and local government institutions have been potentially more effective at responding to the health crisis than those countries with a very centralized approach. Now, it may be too early to say on that, but I do think we need to find a way of ensuring that local government gets whatever it takes, to use that phrase, in order to deliver on the recovery agenda. So there's a structural issue there as to how money is wisely spent to help lift economies out of the effects of the pandemic.
Thank you. Yeah. And Ciaran, I guess the same question to you, and some of the things that people on this call may practically get on and do as well, if there are any that spring to mind.
Well, I mean, on the broad sectors question, I'd agree with Alexandra. In many ways, it's too early to tell. But I guess what we do know is that we need to distinguish, as I was alluding to earlier, between the very short, immediate effects on individual sectors, and then the slightly sort of probably more medium-term effects. And I think that will play out quite differently. And I think a lot of the sectors that people have been talking about right now, around sort of construction or retail or hospitality, there will be long-term effects, but also some of those statistically will come back as and when restrictions allow that to happen. In terms of the sort of spatial picture or pattern, I mean, we've just done a piece of work, a local economic risk index, which, if it's not on your the IED's COVID page, I'll certainly arrange to get that added, if that's helpful. But what we've done as part of that is we've basically looked at using the current sector impact assumptions, and with the caveat, of course, I think those are going to continue to change, is that point similar to the Royal Society around what does that look like when applied to the proportion of the business space, the proportion of employees and the proportion of output. Because I think quite importantly, each of those means and looks like something different in a local area. So you can lose output in an economy locally, but you might not actually notice it immediately. What you will notice, picking up Suzanne's point earlier, is if your business space starts to fall away very quickly. And the longer this temporary crisis continues, and at whatever point some of those government mechanisms are withdrawn, that will be a very tangible effect felt in a particular kind of local area. And I think what that index has found is that actually the pattern is quite mixed, but perhaps the generality, probably of no great surprise, I suppose, if you think about it, is that broadly more mono-sector locations, whatever those may be, are broadly more at risk than locations which have a broader economic base. And that's a concept we would all be familiar with. So you do see a lot of that initial hit, for example, being focused in our coastal communities. They're facing the same challenge they faced in 08-09, to be honest, and all the regeneration work that's been done before and since those. So I think some of those vulnerabilities that we're all familiar with will start to kind of be reappear. And I guess the question then is, how do we continue to drive progress in those? But certainly I would say that in terms of tangible actions, I think there's a real need to blend, as I say, some of that broader macro and scientific framework, if you like, that we're now all operating within, with that local understanding, picking up David's point about, what is it that particular subsectors, particular businesses are saying on the front line, and to move fairly quickly within whatever level we're operating at to how can we prioritise and redeploy our resources here and now to mitigate the worst of the effects. I think there will be a genuine debate to be had. which by the straw poll, our audience obviously believes we can do well to make, which is, you know, to secure probably more money from government ultimately, as the fallout of this particular pandemic becomes kind of clearer. But I think, I'm not sure we can wait around for that. I think as far as we're able to, we need to be acting now, because there is a genuine risk that large swathes of productive capacity of the economy, be it in terms of the business base or our key sectors or R&D investment, whatever it may be, will genuinely be lost. And we thought we had problems with a productivity gap before this particular point in time. Will be interesting to see where we end up after this.
Thanks, Ciaran. I'm going to ask Suzanne next, insofar as representing an area with tremendous added value, a lot of science-based companies, maybe under normal circumstances, the kind of businesses that are more resilient. How do you see the sector balance, and also this match between what you do in the immediate term and what you're going to start to do from a longer term perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge. I mean, you know, I'm very lucky to be working in you know, one of the fastest growing areas of the UK economy in terms of science and technology around Oxfordshire. That's to say, obviously, we've got some big players within there. So actually, we've got the first vaccine centre being built at the moment at Harwell campus, which the government, without planning permission, have started on ground a couple of weeks ago. So great to see those kind of developments coming forward. But in terms of the bigger picture, those facilities, whilst, you know, receiving a lot of government intervention and support, do rely on a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship coming out from universities, coming internationally into the UK and developing into those institutions. So going back to your earlier point about pipeline, in terms of the pipeline for those industries, I think, you know, there's a question mark there, because they're the very sorts of businesses that are on the breadline that are really struggling at the moment. They're the one-man bands, and they're you know, sort of 90% of our economy in the patch where I'm working is made up of those sorts of businesses. It's those businesses that we need to keep going. It's those businesses we need to support and find a way to support to lead to the next big scientific discovery and the next invention or the next kind of flow through those big institutions. And it's only when they get to that certain scale that they then attract the government intervention or government support normally. And I think where we're going to really need to intervene is at that initial seed level, and to encourage that flow. So there'll be a lot of people out there that are thinking, I don't want to take this forward at this current time, don't know where the economy is going. How do we give our community and our businesses that certainty and that comfort to be able to take the risk to develop their business, to grow the business and employ people?
I am struck between the difference between the one-man band that actually involves very little capital, you know, or the 5-person company that involves very little capital, and that scientific business that does involve capital, where there's a whole lot more risk at stake. I mean, one's quite easily replaced in really relatively short time, but the other are rather more problematic if you lose it. Yeah,
and you know, at the moment, we're not seeing a great deal of inward investment inquiries coming through, and that pipeline of inquiries has dried up. What's going to happen to that, and actually how, you know, where's our focus as local government professionals going to be? Is it on that inward investment work, or is it on supporting that local supply chain and that local business community? We can't do it all. So how do we manage both of those?
Tough choices are one of the things I think all local authorities are facing now in terms of priorities, aren't they? It's probably a bit glib. As the planning authority for this vaccine plant, I was wondering about the enforcement order, but I think that's a question for another day.
We have to be handed on this occasion.
David, these tough choices and the sectors that can win and the decisions you've got to make. How are you seeing it from a Hampshire perspective?
Yeah, I suppose my philosophy on all this has changed over the years. I think I suppose I'm someone that believes we're not very good in the public sector at sort of identifying where the growth is going to come in the future. I think what we have to try and do is create that environment in which innovative companies will flourish. And I suppose, I mean, I suppose there's two aspects again to my response. One is just quickly around that kind of inward investment point. I mean, interestingly, we have, and it is quite sort of strange in current circumstances, but we are still seeing some quite interesting inquiries and opportunities coming forward, you know, around areas like space technology, autonomous systems and various other things, which is quite reassuring that very much at that innovation and technology end of the spectrum, despite the current crisis, there are still companies that are seeing the UK as the right place to invest, and clearly that is reassuring on lots of levels. I think there is something though about, some of you will remember the government many moons ago going through this kind of business support simplification process and everything. It amazes me because if what we've got now is the simplified version, I dread to think what it was like before. But I do think there's again something about, we do manage to make everything incredibly complex. And I think one of the things that's sort of been, I think in a sense, highlighted in the current crisis is the fact that that business support landscape needs to be simplified further. You know, we've got growth hubs, we've got chambers of commerce, and we've got lots of other organisations in that landscape. And I think for businesses, it's incredibly confusing to know what is the right place to go to for the right kind of quality of advice. And something that's actually been emerging in Hampshire, which is interesting, it's not yet kind of completely secured, but is the proposals for a community bank, which is more along the lines of the German regional bank kind of ethos. And I do think that's something that's sort of missing, is something in the UK where businesses that genuinely are built around the ethos of supporting small businesses long term, maybe taking a slightly more risk positive approach to business as well. I think that's something we're missing. I think finally what's interesting is what the government's proved. The planning bit was interesting, wasn't it? Because I think one of the things that's been proved over the last few weeks, which I do find reassuring, is when the push comes to shove, we can actually push a lot of bureaucracy to one side and act quite positively and quite quickly. I just wish a little essence of that was retained after the crisis, that we become a bit more can-do. I've come across a few opportunities in my career where, particularly in England, we're still very dependent on the Whitehall system to back the regions around, particularly around kind of key inward investment projects. And it would be great to see a slightly more aggressive ethos around attracting investment. I think the devolved administrations have demonstrated that for a long time. It would be great to see England have an essence of that after this crisis.
Thanks, David. It would indeed. I think while that was going on, Alexander, you had one last point to raise.
Thanks, Nigel. I was just going to say, you know, I think that we're going to find out a huge amount about how our economy actually works and what its interdependency is, and you know, we should take the opportunity to gain and capture as much understanding of how the economy actually does interplay between regions and sectors as possible. I mean, just by very quickly, one example, work we've recently done for the GLA, looking at London's relationship with the rest of the UK economy, identified that the hospitality sector in the West Midlands and London had particularly strong linkages. So I think if we can sort of pick up, analyze, share between ourselves as much as we can about what those relationships are, we can then help each other, you know, from an authority and regional basis to prepare the best responses to helping to facilitate the economy. So I know that isn't necessarily easy to do, but given some of the more real-time information we have about transactions and what people are doing and all the rest of it, coupled to the more historical data on that front, you know, I think there is an opportunity to to think about how regions can support each other during the recovery phase. I think that will be really important.
I agree. I think actually reinventing supply chains is going to be, I think, part of the story of all of this after we're through the worst of it. I'm going to pass over in a second to Bev just to close out. I want to add my personal thanks to everybody on the panel and the time that you spent. And as I say, particularly Arup and Lichfields, who are both long-term supporters of the IED, and to remind people that you were kind enough to raise 27 questions during the course of this. I think we've touched on some of the themes, but we will be answering some more of those on the website, so do come back and look. But thank you very much, and I'm just going to hand over now to the chair of the IED, Bev Hurley.
Hi, thank you, Nigel, and thanks from me from the panel. I think we've had some really interesting questions raised, and I'm very aware that we haven't had the time to go through them all, and so it's great that we'll be able to canvass our panel and put some more thoughts up on the website. One that struck me was the questions around corporate social responsibility and social value, and whether we're going to have more robust metrics to start evaluating and monitoring that. So our big research project on that particular topic is now coming to fruition, so we will be giving you some more information on that. I'm also delighted, as our first IED webinar, Nigel, you were very brave, very good chairing. We had over 200 people at one stage, which is brilliant. I'm pretty zoomed out because I've been supporting businesses all day via Zoom, but this, hearing the level of knowledge and expertise and worry and concern and ideas in this room, I thought was really successful. So I'm very grateful to you, Nigel and Sarah Lynn in the background, for enabling us to run this webinar. I hope we'll do more on it. We should have a poll, Sarah Lynn, if it's not too late, to say, would you like more of these? But I'm sure we will do some more webinars very soon. And thank you all for joining in and for posing your questions, and we'll come back to you with some more thoughts on those. So thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
We'll now close. So thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.